So good morning. I'm really delighted to be here with for the opening with Aaron and with all the team, the Stillpoint team from the other cities as well. My presentation this morning will be a limited, and I like to say limited, journey into the psyche of today's corporate world. It is a very complicated world we live and work in, and yes, technology is very helpful. But today, the digital revolution we are facing is also a threat for many people and the jobs they once knew. As I learned quickly during my own journey in corporations and through depth psychology, symbols and mythology can often be powerful tools to help us understand complex issues and situations. This is why, some years ago, while being a corporate executive and through depth psychology, and training at the Zurich C.G. Jung Institute, on the other, I decided to explore corporate titans. And I didn't give the name of corporate titans. The US big corporations call themselves corporate titans. And explore the Titanic Syndrome, this is the way I call it, which I am in the process of transforming into a book. So titans in Greek mythology, as we will shortly see, have limited and underdeveloped souls. And big corporations are the perfect environment for them to come back. I myself found my soul had been partially possessed by titans a few years ago. I experienced directly what it means to live with a shrinking pattern of feelings and behaviors that silently developed and grew within my own personality. Obviously, at my own expense, and at first, without my ego, even noticing it, in a sort of blindness of the soul. Later, I was able to understand through my long analytical journey what it means to become titanic, losing one's capacities to think, to imagine, to express one's creativity, to have a shrinking, one-sided soul, becoming harsh and tough, limiting relationships to job expectations and effectiveness, having no time for others, and giving no time to others. It is important to understand that in corporate world, anyone can be possessed by the Titanic Syndrome, and that crossing the line between ethical, soul-respectful, and unethical, soul-mutilating behaviors is very easy, and sometimes very difficult to recognize. We often see extreme titanism when we read about dramatic criminal, financial, and corporate behaviors, or when suicides are reported on the news, as we will see in the case of France Telecom. Nevertheless, these are the visible and devastating ultimate consequences of the Titanic Syndrome. And we need to look more deeply into the substance of daily titanism by recognizing where and how the titans appear in what can be considered the normal functioning of a corporation. It seems from the direct experience of many analyst cabinets today that many patients in analysis have experienced intense personal suffering and experiences, and sometimes difficult real traumas in their professional corporate life. There's a double objective to develop a new analytical approach, understand what kind of internal conflicts and pathology the organization of a corporation carries within itself, and what are the titanic consequences for individuals of the growth and decline of the big corporate titans, especially today in a time of digital disruptive change. It's with great personal humility and with the awareness that this is a very first intuition of a broad and complicated subject that I try to put into words my own professional and analytical experience, and obviously what I've learned from others in books and articles. So, who were the titans? It's important to say, because I think when the Americans call the corporations, the titans, they have no idea that the titans are not nice people. So titans really represent untamed and revolted forces, uprising of matter into which no pure light and no correct shape has yet entered. Unorganized matter, but very active, like a remaining archaic chaos. This indicates that the power of the titans is extremely strong. So I am in the UK, so I needed to talk about a woman, and a woman I met, by the way. And I'm wondering, maybe some of you know who this woman was: a human rights activist, an animal rights activist, a women's rights activist, or a very creative and successful entrepreneur. Probably she was all of these, but certainly she was not a titan. Is it because she was a woman? And by the way, in Greek mythology, it's very interesting. Titanesses, the women, were the ones who saved the children and created the possibility for Zeus to exist, because the father wanted to devour Zeus. So it's interesting to see this shift between the masculine and the feminine. So why Anita Roddick? Anita Roddick is the founder of The Body Shop. And if you see the values she built the company on, she was certainly really trying hard to build a company with really human values. But as for many other aspects of the liberal society, we all hope that the good and ethical companies could make it. And somehow, Anita really did something special for the products she created and for the people who worked for The Body Shop. And I'd like to read what she says about corporations. She says, "The corporation stops people from having a sense of empathy with the human condition. It separates us from who we are. The language of the business is not the language of the soul or the language of humanity. It's the language of indifference. It's the language of separation, of secrecy, of hierarchy. It is fashioning a schizophrenia in many of us." And this is from the book of Joel Bakan, The Corporation. It's a very interesting book, by the way. But yet, Anita Roddick sold The Body Shop to a titan and gave away her company to the French cosmetics giant L'Oréal in March 2006. So 2 years after she had declared what the corporation was about, she sold her company to L'Oréal. And at the time, I was the head of communications at L'Oréal. So I did meet her, and it was very interesting to know her. This is what she says. I think it's very significant. The trouble with the new world we have watched being created over the past decade is that it sees no further than money. People have always been obsessed with money. Of course, greed is old as history. But when the institutions that govern our lives forget there was anything else, then it gets dangerous. So the question we should ask ourselves is not only about understanding the last year's dramatic financial and economic events and collapse. The question is about the fundamentals of corporate economy and organization. Greed and excess are one aspect, but the core issue is also about the overall system, the subtle Prometheanism that is implicit in business organization. Of course, some individuals are possessed by the will to power, as Adler described very well, on their own. But the question is more that technology in itself and corporate hugeness in itself is able to generate some kind of unconscious will to power in the overall system. Even nice people, even ungreedy people, with a very respectable life outside business, just by belonging to the Titanic system, become unwillingly Titanic. And I was one of those, I can really tell you. So, what do you feel when you see all these? Just as a reminder, a typical characteristic of Titans' behavior in Greek mythology is their desire to climb up, always higher, in order to reach the sky and the domain of the Olympians. To achieve this, their technique is brutal and very rough. Accumulation, always accumulation. They pile heavy stones over heavy stones, pieces of mountains over mountains, spending enormous energy to climb and rise. So do you have any idea? Well, unfortunately, it's about him again, because these are all Trump towers in different cities around the world. I will not talk today about what others have written already about Trump's malignant narcissism. I'd like to focus more on Trump as a titan, because the real problem we sometimes try to forget is that it is money that today rules the world, and that probably for the first time in history, with the exception of Mr. Berlusconi in my little country, a real contemporary corporate, very powerful titan has been elected president of the most powerful country in the world. Now, talking about titans, this is another one, and I'd like to mention him because yesterday, during the podcast, that the man was talking about having been ruined by what happened with the subprimes. And I mean, this guy ruined hundreds of thousands of little consumers. So, you know, and this guy, fortunately, is now in jail. But he did the worst things he could do while he was out of jail. And it doesn't really resolve the situation of him being in jail. And unfortunately, as this nice vignette says, many other titans are still out there. It's more easy for Wall Street activists to go into jail than the real titans. There's a very interesting book that appeared last October called Why They Do It, Inside the Mind of White-Collar Criminals. And it was published in October 2016 by Eugene Soltes. And this is what he says. There's a fine distinction between being confident and displaying hubris. The successful financiers, Lord Blankfein of Goldman Sachs and Bill Ackman of Pershing Square Capital, have both expressed how they believe their firms are doing God's work. Even if stated in jest, this belief in the righteousness of their ambitions and the lack of any sense of fallibility is precisely the sentiment formerly held by many executives prior to faltering. This is another author who says, when you read of yet another corporate titan who has it all, money, fame, power, but who blows it all by straying across the line separating aggressive risk-taking from crime, you're driven to ask what possessed them. This is John Coates, former trader and author of The Hour Between Duck and Wolf, How Risk-Taking Transforms Us, Body and Mind. But let's come back to what I like to call engaged psychology. This is what James Hillman wrote about titans and gods, much before I started my work. And it helped me very much in developing my paper. A sign of the absence of gods is hugeness, not merely the reign of quantity, but enormity as a quality. Whether presented in images of multinational corporations, polluted oceans, or vast climatic changes, hugeness is the signature of the absent God. Or let us say, the divine attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence alone remain. Without the benevolent governments of qualifying divinities, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence become gods, as we read just before. In other words, without the gods, the titans return. So it's interesting that several Jungian authors, which I highly respect, like Hillman, Lopez Pedraza, and Luigi Zoya, have written as well about titans and have tried to identify what were their non-qualities, the first of which is emptiness and excess. And what Lopez Pedraza describes compared to the essential virtues of Olympic gods as imagination, sophistic thought, variety and richness of different qualities and personalities for each one of the different gods. And what he says is very important, and I really believe this is totally true, is I consider it the task of those who do not want to be drawn into the collective titanism of today to try to become aware of it constantly, and most difficult of all, to reflect on it and learn from it. The other quality or non-quality is psychic numbing. And this is a concept developed by Robert Lifton in The Protean Self, and it's defined as diminished capacity or inclination to feel and a general sense of stasis and meaninglessness. It's also very well described by Hillman when talking about Titanism in his paper And Huge is Ugly, where he says there's a decomposition of meaning, and where Titanism, excess, control, and repression reign, there's a loss of imagination and beauty. So until now, we spoke about Titans, what can Titans do in the world, outside. In the last part of this presentation, we will look at what can happen inside corporations. And, Stillpoint is about inside and outside. And here what happens inside. And why this is so relevant for engaged analysts. 2009, the year when I was writing my paper, was a horrible year for France Telecom. The avalanche of anxiety had already begun to crash down its share in 2006. Since that time, the company, a giant of telecommunications and one of France's major employers, had fired 1 of every 5 of its employees. And the resulting pressure was from 2 directions: fewer jobs, greater demands for performance, and that had continually increased. So what was causing such an alarm at France Telecom? Between 2008 and 2009, 35 employees had committed suicide. The company was experiencing a sort of suicidal epidemic, but there was also something very different. The relationship between the individual's suffering and the behaviors of the company had become explicit. In various cases, employees who committed suicide directly in the company buildings had written in their letters had accused the company in their letters of explanation. This psychological reality created a new institutional development. Suicide started to be considered as a workplace hazard. In July last year, in 2016, after a very long court case, the CEO of that time, as well as some other members of the management team, were judged guilty of moral harassment. So, economic and financial pressure on companies in times of disruptive digital change as today has never been as strong as it is today. Shareholders and the financial markets require short-term results and commitment from top management. As a consequence, the internal pressure on people to produce innovative products, always with a faster pace, and deliver these results becomes dramatic. And fear is the feeling that pervades everything. The threat is the loss of your job, but also the fear that the company will not survive, and that's what's really happening. Many people in middle management, I personally know, have lost their jobs in the past 3 years. Very often, they have experienced a common process and common reactions. This process, often defined as moral harassment, as we saw earlier, is a growing phenomenon, and the victim of this more or less invisible to Titanic violence, not only lose their jobs, but also important parts of their soul. Sometimes people are simply fired, but more often, if a good reason is not found, a subtle and very painful process is put in place. The clear will is to put the person in such a difficult condition that he or she would just resign without any cost. Here comes the money again for the company. Cost effectiveness in normal times may be a reasonable necessity, but becomes titanic in times of crisis. In some cases, people with a more fragile personality and a weaker ego are submitted to such a difficult suffering that they do decide to resign. They lose twice. They don't obtain any economic advantage, they lose their job, and they pay the psychological consequences of their experience. In other cases, they resist, hoping this might change and also trying to find alternative jobs and financial solutions. But the cost of their resilience can sometimes be devastating, both from a psychological point of view and in some cases also from a physical point of view. The Titans are back, and Titanic tyranny is inviting every day and amputating the soul of many people. The victim-perpetrator game is very common within companies. Oftentimes it is an unconscious game where every individual tries to save himself against the others. It's a Titanic game where being or becoming the perpetrator and finding your own victims within the system is the easiest way out to avoid becoming a victim yourself. So that's why you become Titanic. You have no choice. You have to kill someone else to avoid being killed yourself. So a conscious decision of getting rid of a person in a particular job and function is taken. His boss must act to succeed and therefore protect his own position. Consciously or unconsciously, one becomes a perpetrator, and oftentimes, without even noticing and being aware, you are very quickly driven into the Titanic Syndrome, crossing that line which I talked about before, between an acceptable and ethical behavior and unethical attitudes and behaviors, harsh and violent, unacceptable behaviors. The person chosen as a victim is devaluated and criticized not only for her job, this is what happens, but more directly as a person in the essence of his or her own being. So a person in this situation enters in the painful psychological mood of the victim and can be overwhelmed by symptoms as stress, sleeping problems, psychosomatic problems, fear, and deep guilt, as well as oftentimes by regressive behaviors, and can enter in a true depression. In some cases, the person tries desperately to repair the situation by working harder and longer hours every day to prove that he or she has all the capacities to do the job well, but the doubts about yourself insinuate, and you become always more suspicious, fearful, paranoid. Losing your job can certainly be described in some cases as a real trauma, and oftentimes this trauma awakens previous earlier traumas with even more complicated psychological consequences. As well described by Lopez Pedraza, both the projection of guilt and the carrying of the guilt upon oneself is Titanic. In fact, this is exactly what happens in the process just described. Very frequently, even for persons with a strong ego, there are no ways out. Before concluding, I'd like to bring up a woman that I deeply admire, and this woman was Hannah Arendt, because Hannah Arendt had the intuition of many things that would happen 60 years later. And it's striking how similar the concern that our own experiences nearly 60 years later. Arendt, for instance, wrote about the advent of automation, which threatened to empty the factories and liberate mankind from its oldest and most natural burden, the burden of laboring. In our own day, we are told robots, and that's what's happening, robots will and must take our jobs. So already in 1958, Arendt perceived that the advances of scientific knowledge were secured in the rarefied language of advanced mathematics, a language that was not susceptible to translation into the more ordinary forms of human speech. In a few pages, Arendt managed to present a series of concerns and questions that remain vital today. Can we really think and reflect about what we are doing, particularly with the Promethean powers of modern technology? This is a totally open question, and I think after yesterday in the evening, we should ask this question to ourselves. Second and last thought is this very interesting article that appeared in 2014 on The Economist. And what it says, it's the potential of dramatic change is clear. A future of widespread technological unemployment is harder for many to accept. Every great period of innovation has produced its share of labor market doomsayers, but technological progress has never previously failed to generate new employment opportunities. Just as past mechanization freed or forced workers into jobs requiring more cognitive dexterity, leaps in machine intelligence could create space for people to specialize in more emotive occupations as yet unsuited to machines. A world of artists, therapists, love counselors, and yoga instructors. Such emotional and relational work could be as critical for the future as metal bashing was in the past, even if it gets little respect at first. Cultural norms change slowly. I think this is very important for us at Stillpoint. To conclude, another man that deserves a lot of admiration. Let me tell you about one more personal experience where I suddenly woke up and stopped being infected by the Titanic Syndrome by choosing not to be neutral anymore. A few years ago, I was heading corporate communications for a major corporation. The CEO for whom I was working had been awarded an important prize for including the respect for diversity within the company. The award was offered by Elie Wiesel in New York City with a very significant speech in which he acknowledged the change in time of the company that the company had achieved, but yet recognizing that there had been dark times, and that those dark times were in the 30s, obviously, during the first years of the company's existence. When back in the office, I was asked to produce a video of the ceremony. While working at it, I was called up by top management and was asked to cut off the part of Wiesel's speech on the dark times. It was a brutal wake-up call for me. My answer was that I would only do it if Elie Wiesel would agree. I knew while I was speaking that I would lose my job, and this is exactly what happened after a year of moral harassment nightmare. And to end, I would like to say is that by working and writing this paper, I was able to recover from most of the Titanic non-qualities and discover once more my own reflective, imaginative, and engaged thinking. I like to say engaged thinking. It was a long and difficult, painful process, but I'm very proud having done it. And it is certainly possible to say that if one is able to recover his inner creativity, the numbed soul is brought back to its real and lively potential. There is a great amount of work and projects for Stillpoint spaces that we can achieve together. Thank you.